The embers were still glowing when they discovered Harrison Caldwell's body in his private carriage house, trapped beneath a collapsed beam with his strong box of documents scattered around him like damning evidence. But by then, Mary Foster had already vanished into the network of Virginia's underground railroad stations, carrying with her a secret that would transform her from victim into legend. What drove this enslaved laundress to lock her master in his carriage house and set it ablaze? And how did she navigate the treacherous journey north when slave catchers patrolled every road and river crossing? Before we continue, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The winter morning of 1851 arrived bitter and gray over Caldwell Manor in rural Virginia as Mary Foster made her way across the frozen ground to the laundry house. Her breath formed white clouds in the frigid air, and her thin cotton dress provided little protection against the wind that cut through the valley like a knife. The 24-year-old woman had been born on this plantation, daughter of a field hand and a house slave, and had spent every day of her life within sight of these same rolling hills that imprisoned her. Harrison Caldwell was already awake when Mary arrived, his tall frame visible through the window of the carriage house where he kept his private office. The 41-year-old plantation owner had recently expanded his wealth through a profitable side business that few people knew about. He was a slave trader who specialized in separating families, selling children south to the cotton plantations where labor was cheap and lives were shorter. His meticulous records documented every transaction, every family torn apart, every promise broken for profit. Mary carried her basket of washing across the yard, past the other slaves who moved through their morning routines with the resigned exhaustion of people who had no hope of anything better. She had been assigned to the laundry house since age 12, her small hands perfect for scrubbing the delicate fabrics that Caldwell's wife demanded remain pristine. But Mrs. Caldwell had died 2 years earlier from pneumonia, leaving Mary alone with a master whose attentions had grown increasingly unwanted. Everything had changed 1 week earlier when Mary's 10-year-old son, Samuel, had been sold. The boy had been the product of Harrison Caldwell's nighttime visits to the slave quarters, a fact that everyone knew but no one dared speak aloud. Mary had believed that the blood connection might protect Samuel from the worst fates that awaited enslaved children, but she had been catastrophically wrong. Caldwell had sold his own son to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, pocketing the money and dismissing Mary's screams with cold indifference. "He's property, same as you," Caldwell had told her when she confronted him, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he was discussing the sale of a horse. "And you'd do well to remember your place before I decide to sell you too." But Mary had not accepted her place. That night, she had gone to the carriage house where Caldwell kept his records, searching for some proof of Samuel's sale, some document that might help her find her son. What she discovered was far worse than she had imagined. The ledgers documented hundreds of sales, children as young as 5 torn from their mothers and shipped south. The correspondence revealed a network of traders who competed to see who could separate the most families, who could break the most spirits, who could maximize profit from human misery. Among the papers, Mary found letters that proved Caldwell's involvement in capturing escaped slaves, including detailed descriptions of torture methods used to extract information about underground railroad routes. She read accounts of pregnant women sold south, despite promises to their families, of elderly slaves worked to death because they were no longer profitable, of children deliberately separated from parents to prevent rebellion. The carriage house became a chamber of horrors documented in neat handwriting and careful accounting. The fury that consumed Mary as she read those documents was unlike anything she had experienced. It was not the hot rage of a moment, but a cold, calculated anger that burned like ice. She understood in that instant that Harrison Caldwell would never stop, would never feel remorse, would continue destroying families until someone stopped him. The law protected men like Caldwell while crushing people like Mary, and there was no legal path to justice that did not end with her own death or sale. Mary returned to the laundry house that night and did not sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Samuel, somewhere in Mississippi, probably already broken by the brutal labor of the cotton fields. She thought about all the other children in Caldwell's ledgers, names and ages reduced to columns of profit and loss. She thought about the underground railroad contacts she had heard whispered about, the network of people who helped slaves escape north to freedom. and she thought about fire. The plan took shape slowly over the following days. Mary studied Caldwell's routines, noting when he visited the carriage house how long he stayed, which servants might notice unusual activity. She collected materials that could burn hot and fast, hiding them in the laundry house where no one would question their presence. Lye soap, lamp oil, cotton rags soaked in turpentine. She memorized the layout of the carriage house, identifying the single exit and the heavy beam that supported the roof. On the chosen morning, Mary waited until Caldwell entered the carriage house for his daily review of accounts. She had deliberately left several items of washing unfinished, knowing he would summon her to explain the delay. When the call came, she crossed the frozen yard with her basket, her heart pounding, but her hands steady. Inside the carriage house, surrounded by the documents that chronicled his crimes, Harrison Caldwell sat at his desk, with the confidence of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. "You're behind schedule again," he said without looking up from his ledgers. "I'm beginning to think you need stronger motivation to complete your work properly." Mary set down her basket and moved closer, her eyes taking in the layout one final time. The lamp oil she had brought was hidden beneath the clean linens, and the matches were tucked into her apron pocket. "I understand, Master Caldwell," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I brought the mending you requested." As Caldwell turned to examine the items she held out, Mary's other hand found the bottle of lamp oil. What happened next occurred with the terrible clarity of inevitability. She threw the oil across the papers and ledgers, the liquid splashing across Caldwell's chest and face. His shout of surprise turned to rage as he lunged toward her, but Mary was already moving, striking the matches and dropping them onto the oil-soaked documents. The fire caught instantly, flames racing across the desk and up the walls with hungry efficiency. Caldwell's clothing ignited, and his rage transformed into screams of pain and terror. Mary backed toward the door, watching as the man who had destroyed so many lives tried desperately to beat out the flames that consumed him. She could have opened the door, could have allowed him to escape with burns that might not kill him. Instead, she pulled the door closed from the outside and wedged it shut with a piece of lumber. The screams continued for several minutes while Mary stood in the frozen yard, listening to the sound of justice finally arriving for Harrison Caldwell. Other slaves began emerging from their quarters, drawn by the smoke and noise. But Mary had planned for this. She joined their shocked exclamations, pointing toward the carriage house and crying out about the terrible accident she had witnessed. By the time anyone thought to force open the jammed door, the fire had spread to the roof beam, which collapsed with a crash that ended Caldwell's screams forever. In the chaos that followed, as slaves and overseers rushed to contain the fire and examine the remains, Mary slipped away. She had prepared a small bundle of supplies hidden near the property's northern boundary, and she moved through the confusion with the invisible efficiency that came from years of being overlooked. By the time anyone noticed her absence, she was already miles away, following the stars and the coded directions she had memorized from whispered conversations in the slave quarters. The Underground Railroad had stations throughout Virginia, safe houses operated by abolitionists and free black families who risked everything to help escapees reach the North. Mary had names and landmarks committed to memory, a mental map that would guide her through the dangerous journey ahead. The winter cold that had seemed like an enemy became an ally, freezing the rivers and making it harder for dogs to track her scent. The first station was a Quaker farmhouse 20 miles north, reached after 2 days of traveling only at night and hiding during daylight hours. The family who sheltered her asked no questions about the burns on her hands or the hollow look in her eyes. They fed her, gave her warm clothing, and sent her onward with directions to the next safe house. This pattern repeated through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, each station operated by people who understood that slavery was an evil worth fighting, even at great personal risk. Mary's journey north took 3 weeks, a gauntlet of near captures and desperate escapes that left her exhausted but unbroken. She traveled hidden in hay wagons, walked through frozen streams to throw off pursuit, and once spent an entire day pressed flat in a drainage ditch while slave catchers searched the area around her. The network that moved her northward operated with impressive efficiency, each conductor knowing only enough to complete their segment of the journey, protecting the larger operation from betrayal or capture. In Philadelphia, Mary finally found temporary safety among the city's community of free black residents. She learned that Harrison Caldwell's death had been ruled accidental, the fire attributed to a fallen lamp and poor judgment. But she also learned that his business partners were offering substantial rewards for information about escaped slaves, and that her description was being circulated throughout the South. She could never return to Virginia, could never search for Samuel without risking capture and execution. The grief of that realization was perhaps worse than anything else she had endured. Mary had killed a man and risked everything, but her son remained enslaved, and she had no way to reach him. The victory felt hollow, justice incomplete. She spent weeks in a fog of depression, barely eating, haunted by dreams of Samuel calling for her in the cotton fields, while she stood frozen and unable to help. It was a woman named Harriet who pulled Mary back from despair. Harriet was a former slave herself, famous in the Underground Railroad network for her repeated trips south to guide others to freedom. She found Mary sitting alone in a boarding house, staring at nothing, and sat down beside her with the kind of understanding that came from shared trauma. "You thinking about going back for your boy?" Harriet said, and it was not a question. Mary nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Can't do it alone," Harriet continued, "but you don't have to do it alone. We got a network, people who make it their business to reunite families. It takes time, sometimes years, but we don't give up." The conversation changed everything for Mary. She learned that the Underground Railroad was not just about moving people north, but about maintaining connections, gathering information, and planning rescues. Her knowledge of Caldwell's network, the contacts and methods documented in the ledgers she had read before burning them, made her valuable to the abolitionist movement. She began working with conductors and station masters, helping to identify traders and their patterns, warning families about impending sales. Months turned into years as Mary transformed from escapee into conductor herself. She made the dangerous journey south multiple times, her intimate knowledge of Virginia's plantation system allowing her to move with confidence through territory that terrified others. She specialized in rescuing children, feeling that each successful mission honored Samuel's memory, even though she had not yet found him. The former laundress became known throughout the network as someone who could slip through the tightest security, who never abandoned a mission, who would walk through fire to bring families back together. In 1856, 5 years after she had fled north, Mary finally received word about Samuel. He was alive, working on a plantation near Natchez, Mississippi, but had lost part of his left hand in an accident with cotton gin machinery. The news broke Mary's heart, even as it gave her hope. She began planning immediately, coordinating with conductors who knew the Mississippi routes, gathering intelligence about the plantation's layout and security. The rescue attempt took 6 months to organize and nearly failed multiple times. Mary traveled south, disguised as a free black servant, carrying forged papers that identified her as property of a fictional Maryland family. She worked her way into a position on a neighboring plantation, close enough to make contact with Samuel through the network of slaves who passed information between properties. The moment she saw her son, now 15 and hardened by years of brutal labor, Mary knew that the risk had been worth it. Samuel barely recognized her at first, his childhood memories faded by trauma and time. But when Mary whispered his birth name, the name she had given him before Caldwell had registered him in the plantation ledgers, recognition flooded his face. The reunion was brief and tear-filled, conducted in the shadows of a storage barn while other slaves stood watch. They had perhaps 10 minutes together before the danger of discovery forced them apart. But Mary used those minutes to explain the escape plan and to promise that she would not leave Mississippi without him. The escape itself nearly ended in disaster. Samuel and 3 other slaves from his plantation fled during a thunderstorm, using the rain and noise to mask their movement. Mary met them at a predetermined location, an abandoned cabin that abolitionists had secretly stocked with supplies. But slave catchers were closer than anticipated, and the group found themselves pursued through swampland that threatened to swallow them whole. Mary drew on memories of stories she had heard about Sarah Daniels and the Louisiana Bayou, using similar tactics to throw off the pursuers. They traveled through water to hide their scent, used mud to disguise their appearance, and moved with the kind of desperate efficiency that comes from knowing capture means death. For 3 days they stayed ahead of the hunters, finally reaching a contact who smuggled them onto a riverboat heading north. The journey back to Philadelphia took weeks and nearly broke them multiple times. Samuel's injured hand became infected, and they had to stop at a station in Tennessee while he recovered. Mary used the time to work with other conductors, helping to move more families northward, unable to rest while others remained enslaved. By the time they finally reached Pennsylvania, Samuel was beginning to heal both physically and emotionally, and Mary felt a sense of completion that had eluded her for years. The years that followed brought both triumph and tragedy. Mary continued her work with the Underground Railroad until the Civil War made such clandestine operations obsolete. She lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation, though she understood that freedom on paper did not immediately translate to freedom in practice. Samuel grew into a man who carried scars from his childhood but refused to be defined by them, eventually becoming a teacher who educated formerly enslaved children. Mary Foster died in 1889 at the age of 62, surrounded by the extended family she had helped reunite over decades of dangerous work. Her obituary in the black newspapers of Philadelphia described her as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but made no mention of the fire that had killed Harrison Caldwell. That secret died with her, though some whispered that the burns on her hands told a story she never fully shared. Today, Caldwell Manor is a historical site that tours discuss without mentioning the true circumstances of Harrison Caldwell's death. The Carriage house was rebuilt after the fire, and visitors hear sanitized stories about plantation life that omit the family separations and systematic cruelty that defined the place. But in the communities descended from the people Mary helped rescue, her story survives in its fuller truth, a reminder that resistance takes many forms and that justice sometimes requires fire.